Well, welcome to our webinar this afternoon. Apologies, it's a little bit of a different time. I know probably people who've been on our webinars before have realised that we tend to do it first thing in the morning on a Thursday, but we thought we'd just change up a little bit today. So for those of you who don't know me, I am Marie Cheng. I am the Partnerships Manager here at myhrtoolkit, and I'd like to welcome you all to today's webinar. So again, imagine a number of you might have already heard about the fact that we've been doing quite a lot of different webinars, lots of different topics from furlough, obviously when everything started happening with lockdown, to a range of different business topics, and they've been quite popular throughout the year. So obviously we've started 2021 working from home, and we've started a series of webinars that we've tried to aim that more at the SME and the HR professional. And the first of which today that we're going to be looking at is how to run engaging webinars as an HR professional. So I will introduce you shortly to our resident webinars guru, Camille, who will be hosting this. But I guess just something to note that we've just obviously realised that with so many webinars that have been happening in 2020, we thought it might just be really helpful to run a session on some tips and tricks of how to run your own webinars, how to make them stand out, and also some tools on how to keep your audience engaged. So Camille will take us through that in a second. In terms of the format of how it will run, we will spend 20-25 minutes going through some of the material, and then at the end we'll have some time to answer some of your questions. So just a couple of things just to note. At the bottom or the top of your screen, you should see on the Zoom menu, there's a question and answers box. So feel free throughout the webinar to pop your questions in there as you go along, and then we can answer that at the end. There's also a chat box option, which you would probably already see, and we've kind of put a couple of messages in there to ask any, I mean, if you could ask the questions in the questions and answer box so that we could make sure that the questions don't get lost. But if you have any other things to note, like if you can't hear the sound or anything like that, just pop a message in the chat and we will look to sort that out for you. Bit more housekeeping, just to clarify that obviously today's session is offering general advice, tips and best practice from Camille. And also, again, just a bit of a reminder, but we will send a follow-up at the end of this webinar with a recording, as well as an invitation to the next webinar, which is looking at why social media is an HR professional's best friend. So I'll add a link to the registration page in the chat shortly once we've started, so that people who can register for that in a couple of weeks on the 4th of February. So intros, so as I said, we're going to talk about how to run an engaging webinar. So Camille is from our marketing team. I will let Camille introduce herself in her presentation, so I will pass that over to Camille.
Hi everyone, hi, thank you very much, Marie. That was a lovely intro. I've not been called a guru very often before, so that's very nice. I'm just going to share my slideshow first. If you bear with me one sec, should be able to share my screen. Fabulous. So you should be seeing my little face there on the screen. As Marie mentioned, I'm Camille Brouard. I'm the Senior Marketing Executive here at myhrtoolkit. And I've been with the team since early 2019, and actually my photo there on the slideshow is from 2019, from our staff photo shoot. As you can see, I look a bit different now, and I mean, loads of things have been different since the year that was 2020, which is kind of what I was thinking about when I started making this presentation. So I've got a bit of an updated picture here. That's a picture of me and my dog Louie. Because we've been through lockdowns this year, we've been through home working. Me personally, I've gone from living in Sheffield to living back with family in Guernsey for a little while, hence I'm hanging out with my dogs. I'd be curious to know where you guys are all calling in from, so if you want to let me know in the chat where you're coming in from, how the weather is there today. It's raining here, it's miserable, but you know, it happens. So I don't know if you want to get involved in the chat. Oh, we've got some people coming in. Brilliant. See if I can get that back up. Oh, I'm having Zoom problems already. I say I'm a webinar expert and I'm like, oh, hang on, what am I doing? Because I'm so used to being on the other end of things. Alicia says she's coming in from Telford and it's been snowing. I have a friend who lives near Telford. I've been before. Very cool. Marie says at least it stopped raining in Sheffield. Not in Guernsey yet, but we'll get there. Carrie's coming in from Manchester. Catherine's at home in Leeds. Charlotte's coming in from Sheffield, so you're not missing much. I do miss Sheffield though. Natalie's also coming in from Sheffield. Amazing. Nikki's coming in from Manchester as well. We've got some people from the Manchester crew. Beth's coming in from Nottinghamshire. This is great. Oh, and Sarah's coming in from Camberley. Clear and sunny here today, and it's been a lovely day. What, is there like a local climate in Camberley? That's amazing. And Natalie asks how many people are tuning in. There's about 20 of us here, so a really nice little crew, and it's lovely to have you all here today. Fabulous. So without further ado, and on the subject of just things that have been big changes over the last year, one of them has definitely been the rise in popularity of the webinar, which is what we're talking about today, on how to run engaging webinars, specifically as a HR professional in the HR field. I mean, webinars were popular before, they were around. Here at Toolkit, we were already thinking about running webinars and getting training, but then 2020 hit, lockdown hit, home working, and it just became such a prevalent thing for everyone. And at Toolkit, it was no different. We started running our topical webinar series, which some of you may have been on before with us, as Marie mentioned, and they've proved to be really popular. We've had about 50 plus attendees to those webinars on average, and they've been covering a lot of HR and employment law, business related topics. And this year we've actually expanded out with our series of webinars for HR professionals, which this is the first. So you guys are trailblazers. Thank you very much for coming along. And also another question I've got, did you run any webinars in 2020 and what did you run them about? I'm just curious to know where you guys are coming from in your sort of webinar activities as well. So I'll just wait a little bit for people to get involved there. Fab. Yeah, Beth says they've been running some webinars on employment law. Oh, and just a note, Marie's put in a link to our next webinar, which is on social media for HR professionals with our social media exec, Hannah. I do suggest signing up because she's great at presentations. Katie says they've not done any as of yet. Well, you're in the right place. And we all get started at some point. And Alicia said that they did one on redundancy aimed at accountants, as they seem to have struggled with how employment and tax laws overlap. That sounds really interesting and really in depth and great for that audience as well. Brilliant. Okay. So as you can see there from the examples I've just read out, you know, you may think that webinars are just all about sort of sales and that's what it used to be about quite a bit more. But now we can see that so many HR people have started doing webinars as well, and it's become a really, really great thing for HR, whether you're in-house and you're doing webinars for your staff, or whether you're a consultant doing webinars for clients, or you're reaching out to the business community. Okay, so I'll just pop on to my next slide. Just before we launch into things, I thought I'd quickly go through the agenda, just a little whistle-stop tour. Firstly, we're going to be looking into how to advertise your webinars and attract registrations, because you can run beautiful webinars, but if no one turns up, it's you know, can be a bit disheartening, even though some webinars only a few people turn up and have a fantastic time. So you just never know. But you know, the more the merrier, basically, with webinars. So we'll be going through how to get people to sign up, and then we'll be moving on to the sort of the webinar itself and prepping for that, and having a smooth and professional presentation style, because it can be a bit daunting when you start webinars. I remember last year, it felt like a bit of a baptism of fire when we were like, right, we're doing lots of webinars now, and we're going to get going. And it's like, ooh, it can be quite a lot to take in. But then the more you practice and the small sort of things you have in place, the easier it gets. So I'll be running through a few of those tips. Okay, and then we'll be going more specifically into how to keep your audience engaged, because there are particular techniques you can use on webinars, because, you know, I can't see you guys right now and interact with you. I'm just sort of talking to my screen. So it can be quite weird to kind of gauge how people are interacting with it. So there's little things you can do just to keep people involved and start communicating, start a bit of a conversation. And then we're going to be looking at what to include in follow-up materials after the webinar, because that's also another great opportunity to engage with your webinar audience and anyone who couldn't make it as well, and sort of further get your information out there. And last but not least, we're going to be having a Q&A at the end, so make sure to have your questions ready. And as Marie said, there is a Q&A option in Zoom in the menu, so you can pop into there and ask a question there, and then we'll be able to read through those at the end. Okay. Oh, and Sarah just said about webinars, that their charity has to run quite a lot of webinars on new membership options, but nothing for me on HR so far. Well, these rules are, well, rules. what rules? These sort of techniques and tips and tricks you can use for webinars, you can use across a range of things, but I just thought we'd have a bit of a webinar HR focus, just because that's one of our little areas of expertise. We talk to HR people, and yeah, we want to hear from you as well. Okay, so, and here's the exciting bit. We're going to have to run this poll in a sec. I thought it'd be a great way to interact with you guys, to run a poll with a couple of questions. So I'll put that up in a second, but just as a little overview, the first question is going to be, how confident do you feel at running webinars? And then the second question will be, how are you planning to run, or indeed already running webinars? As you can see, some of you are in the thick of running webinars, some people are thinking about it. So that's kind of aimed at both groups. So all things going well, I am going to launch the poll now. So hopefully that should be coming up on your screen, and there should be a little option in the toolbar for polls. Yep, I can see some of you are voting. Fantastic. So I'll just leave a minute for you to vote. Fab, as most people have voted. I'll just wait a few more seconds if anyone else wants to vote. It's all anonymous as well, so don't worry about it. I'm not going to go, oh, so-and-so says this. Okay, yeah, fab, that is everyone. Okay, I'm going to end the poll, so you should be able to see the results. Okay, I'll just share those results now. Fab, so let's have a look at the first question. It's, how confident do you feel at running webinars? Most people are feeling fairly confident, which I like. I tend to feel fairly confident as well. So that's, no, I'm extremely confident, of course, as the webinar guru. Yeah, that makes sense to me, like quite a range of experience with webinars there. So obviously some people will just be like, I literally have no idea what I'm doing, goodness me. And other people will think, yeah, I've got the skills. But, you know, by the end of this, I'll have given you a good grounding in lots of easy ways to make sure those webinars go smoothly and just what to do. And the second question is, how are you running or planning to run webinars? More people are planning to run them every now and then. And actually a similar amount of people are planning to run them on a regular schedule, and some people aren't sure yet. Yeah, it's interesting because we run webinars on a fairly regular schedule, but obviously not everyone's going to want that style. It will be more sort of, let's address this as it comes up kind of thing on the topics that matter right now, and both ways totally work, but that gives me more of an idea of what you guys are looking for. Fab, so I'll just stop those results. Okay, thank you very much for everyone taking part. That's wonderful. Right, so I'm going to go into the nitty-gritty now of what I have to share today. So section 1 is advertising webinars and attracting registrants. So kind of your pre-webinar activities to get people on board. And I would say one of the most important things to think about first, it's probably obvious, but there you go, is to think about your topic and how you're going to really choose great topics that are going to appeal to your audience, whether that's your staff or your clients or the business community. You've got to think about where they're coming from and what's going to interest them. So I'd make sure it's timely. For example, we've done a lot of COVID-19 related webinars last year, and I mean, unfortunately, it looks like we'll be doing a few more this year because it is still very much at the center of things. So those are very timely topics. So we've done a lot of sort of HR and employment law areas, but specifically in relation to COVID, because that's on a lot of people's minds at the moment. And then it's also about, you know, as with any guide or anything, is sort of thinking about what questions people are asking and maybe what worries they have around things, particularly, you know, quite difficult topics like redundancy, and just thinking about what their worries are and how your webinar can answer those, because that will definitely reach to people and they'll go, yes, I really need to know more about that. So that's my first tip. And as for the advertising part of things, social media advertising is really useful. I suggest using a scheduling platform like Hootsuite is a free one you could get. I don't know if anyone has experience with those before, but you can use that to schedule in tweets and LinkedIn posts and Facebook posts in advance at a regular schedule. So sort of 2 weeks out, 1 week out, 2 days out, just to remind people the webinar's coming up. Because the first time they see it, they may go, oh, I'm interested in that, yeah, and then promptly forget about it or whatever, because, you know, we've all got other stuff going on. And then the reminders will make people go, oh yeah, I need to register for that. Or they might not have seen the first one on social, because things can move quite quickly, especially on Twitter. And on that note, I would say to kind of follow the general guidelines for each platform on how often to post. For example, Twitter, things get lost really quickly in the feed, so you may want to post a bit more frequently, whereas LinkedIn, 1 or 2 posts will probably do the trick. So that's my tip on social. And specifically for LinkedIn, which I think is a really great platform for webinar advertising, you can create events on LinkedIn. So you can run your webinar on there as an event and build that from your business page. And you can invite your connections along to that event, which is super useful for getting the word out there, and then people can accept, and then you can message them to say, hey, here's the registration link, and get them signed up on that. So it's a really great way to get the word out. You can also send the direct messages in general. You can post in groups as well, sort of any like HR or small business related groups if you're working with SMEs, for an instance, or perhaps like a staff group if you've got sort of internal groups. Yeah, LinkedIn is really, really useful. And also, boring but important, emails. I send out quite a lot of emails for webinars. A lot of our customers and current partners are really interested in our webinars. So it's a great way to use your current contacts, keep people involved. Of course, if you're doing in-house webinars for your staff, that would be one of your main areas to use. But yeah, don't underestimate the power of email. It's really good. And yeah, my other point is that if you have a guest speaker, that means you're not having to advertise your webinar alone, which is fantastic. You can use their network and connections as well and encourage them to post it out on their networks. So you're effectively having double the reach, which is a great thing to do as well. Okay, so those are my main points on advertising the webinar. And if we move on a little more towards the webinar itself, although we will be discussing a few sort of things to do in advance, this is all about having a smooth and professional presentation style. Shows a little image, another one from me from the staff shoot there in an actual office. Goodness, what was that all about? Right, so I'll stop getting distracted. Yeah, one of the main things I think is a great thing to do before the webinar itself is to have a practice call. Which, especially if you're quite new to running webinars or you've got a guest speaker on and you've not done a webinar with them before, it's a great way just to hop in onto a call on the platform you'll be using. For example, I don't know if you'd be using Zoom, but that's what we use. We can run a practice call, get all the guest speakers and our speakers in, and just make sure everyone's tech is working. They're confident sharing their slides and taking control of that if they want to. It just helps you avoid mishaps on the day. Practice makes perfect and all that. And I also think it's good to do a little bit of testing on the day for the attendees as well, such as yourselves. We did play some fetching music at the start just to make sure that your audio is all working. Just because that's, you know, makes it a bit more interesting, the silence at the start when everyone's just waiting around for things to start. And then it also means that if someone is having an audio issue, we can post in the chat to say, we're playing some music. And if someone goes, oh, I can't hear that, oh dear, we can then help them sort it out before the webinar begins, so they're not sort of scrambling around going, oh God, I can't hear anything, I'm missing it all. So it just kind of takes some of the worry out for the attendees as well. Okay, so I just wanted to make a little note at this point on some of the techie stuff, because I know that can be like one of the most daunting things when it comes to starting webinars. Just don't panic, in the words of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. You know, it's going to be all right. I think it can be quite nerve-wracking when you've got to sort of sort a lot of different functionality and make sure everything's working, but sometimes technical errors will happen. You know, people's internet won't be working, and sometimes when you're presenting from home, the dogs start barking, the doorbell will go. You know, my cat's literally sleeping behind me right now. He could just jump up on the desk. It might happen, I can't guarantee it, but these things happen. And you know, I think that when you're in the audience's shoes, you do kind of think, well, yeah, these things happen. It just makes it all a bit more human as well. It doesn't have to be a well-oiled machine all the time. So the best thing you can do if something does go wrong, just let the audience know that it's happening. For example, if a guest speaker's internet drops out, just pop on and say, oh, looks like, you know, maybe you could pop up and say, oh, looks like we've lost Camille a little bit. We're going to see if we can get her back on. So sorry, but just bear with us for a minute, and then, you know, see if it sorts itself out. Worst case scenario, you may have to reschedule if something's gone really, really wrong. But these things do happen with regular meetings and lectures and things like that as well. So no different, even though we're virtual. Okay, just gonna move on to the introduction part of the webinar. So we're getting on to the webinar proper now. I think a really good thing to do when you're introducing the webinar, just so you remember to hit all those little information points that are really helpful for the attendees on the day, to use a little script. We use a script at Toolkit, and then we basically just pop in the information that we need. And we also like to provide a link to our next webinar at the start as well, so we make sure we've got the link for that and all those little things, just so it's all ready to go. And so when you're starting to speak to people, you're not going, oh God, I hope I haven't forgotten anything. What about that thing? Oh, I don't know. Yeah, maybe that's just me. I'm not sure. I get a bit scatterbrained when I'm speaking, but so I'd like to have my notes with me. But that can be really helpful. And on the note of upcoming webinars, it's really important to mention them at the start, because basically at the end of the webinar, naturally some people will drop off. It happens, and I'm not going to judge you if you do that at the end of the webinar. We all have busy lives, so some people might have to go a bit early, and so it's good to get that link out there at the start, just so in case anyone is interested, they've got plenty of time to sign up. Okay, I've got a few more bits on presentation style, more about the actual sort of slideshow and the presentation itself. So I would suggest these are just quite general known rules around slideshows, but make sure you've got fairly minimal info on the slides, just because you don't want it to be a reading activity for your audience. You want to be giving that extra value in what you're saying, instead of sort of leaving it all to them to read and get distracted. And using images is great as well. I don't know if I'd recommend using that many images of yourself. It's really weird for me looking at myself on the screen right now, but there you go. So I'd also suggest using subtle animation, which I obviously did not achieve there. The swivel is not the most subtle animation you can choose, but there we go. I usually like to just use the fade in option and do it on click, so I can just put in the next thing whenever I'm ready, because my timing's pretty shabby. So yeah, I think subtle animation is good, and it also means that when you're kind of going on to your next point that you're talking about, you can just introduce things one by one, so you're not just flooding the screen with information. Okay, and in terms of the actual structure, which you'll see in my presentation today as an example, it's great to have a little summary at the start with the sort of agenda that I had at the start, go through the points in order, so I've kind of got an ordered list, and then do a quick summary again at the end, just to kind of touch base on what you've covered and the information that's just been learned, because it helps people digest that. Also, just I am a marketing person, so this is constantly on my mind, but using some branding options is great as well. So for example, we've got our toolkit teal, as I like to call it, in quite a lot of our presentation colors there. We've got a logo there as well, just it just makes it ours really, and it's those subtle little cheeky marketing reminders about who's bringing the presentation to you, etc., just showing you the inside of the machine there. And then also putting in your contact information as well, or any just relevant stuff that you want people to know. And also, if you have a guest speaker, I know that some people won't, and for example, this is all internal, this webinar, but on a lot of our topical webinars, we do have guest speakers from ranging backgrounds. And if they're comfortable presenting their own slides, you might want to practice handing that over to them, just to make sure it's all nice and smooth in that practice call. Or it may be that you show the slides and that they're speaking over the slides. So it's a good thing to discuss with them in advance, just on the topic of presentations. Okay. Right, and next up is keeping your audience engaged, because you can definitely go towards that with a great topic, a good speaker, and a really nice presentation, but there are other things you can do as well, some of which I've already been using in this webinar, so that's fun. Firstly, it's really great to just ask people questions. Like at the start, I asked where you were all hailing in from, just because partly I'm nosy and I like to know, it's fun. And then also just what you guys are doing in terms of running webinars and any examples, just have a chat about it. And it just gets everyone involved and conversing. And I think, it's just a bit nicer than just listening to one person blab on, really, isn't it? So that's a great thing to do. And it's great to name check people as well. This is one thing I've learned from my sort of research into webinars, because I don't know about you guys, but when someone on a webinar goes, "Oh, so and so said this," you're like, "Oh, that's me, brilliant." So it's just a nice thing to get people involved. I would advise just using first name, obviously, because of like privacy issues. You don't really want to be like reading out people's full names, and yeah, it's just a better way to do things, but it's enough that people will go, ah, yes, that's me, brilliant. Okay. Another great thing to do, which I did earlier, is to run polls, which most webinar applications should have poll functionality. Like Zoom does, for example. It's quite easy to use. And polls really help you as a speaker tailor what you're saying to your audience and kind of like link it back to what they're doing and what they're thinking about. And it also gets your audience thinking about how the information they're learning applies to them. And how they can go on using that, because it's more just in a context of what they're doing. So that's really powerful. And last but not least, and something we'll be moving on to in a bit, is to use a Q&A. That's a great way to interact with your audience. They get to ask the questions they want to ask, which is really useful. And that's the extra value that people get out of attending webinars, such as you've chosen to do today, is that they can actually get their specific questions answered and chat to the experts about anything they need to chat about. So you do get that extra value out of that. And again, you can sort of address the question askers by name when you're reading out their question, and that just makes them feel more involved. And a couple of notes on the Q&A. I'd say to give about half the time of the presentation to do the Q&A, so you've got plenty of time. I would also have some backup questions available just in case people are a bit shy on asking questions. I can see a couple coming in, so I don't think that would be the case today. But it's good to have backup questions just in case. Or if you're feeling really keen, you can ask your audience to submit questions in advance, which is great when you have a guest speaker, because then they can run through some of the questions and prepare their answers in advance. So just a few things we picked up from running Q&As. Okay, and I'll just do a quick look through follow-up materials. This is post-webinar, how to kind of keep that relationship going, keep that information out there, and keep people engaged after the webinar. So I suggest emailing, or however is best to message the people who attended your webinar, and then also the people who didn't attend the webinar as well, because they'll still benefit from the follow-up materials, especially if they've missed the presentation. That means they'll still get some value out of registering. So a bit of an obvious one, but it always works quite nicely, is to have access to your webinar recording. So if you record your webinars, as we're recording this one today, so we will send that out in the follow-up materials. That means that anyone who missed the webinar can catch up with it, and then anyone who did go to the webinar just has it for their own records if they ever need to go back to it. And other things you can send for follow-up materials, I suggest if you have any articles on that topic or related to it that you think they'd be interested in based on having been to the webinar, definitely send those on. You know, like I've actually been writing up a PDF version of this presentation that I'm planning to send out to you guys as a follow-up, because that's very related, but it's just in a different medium. So you can read that and digest that instead of in the webinar format. And then if, you know, per se you had blog posts related to your webinar, definitely send those on, because it's just keeps people engaged. And also, particularly if you don't have a lot of internal resources, like not everyone is running a blog with posts every week and has that output, having useful external resources, particularly ones that you used to research your webinar or things that you think would be great further reading, definitely pop those in as well, because that brings extra benefit. And of course, last but not least, make sure to include a link to your next webinar, because that will keep people in that pipeline of engaging with your webinars. I'll sign up to the next one, and yeah, you can keep engaging with them. Okay, so just before we move on to the Q&A, I'll just quickly summarize what we went through in this session. So firstly, I covered how to advertise your webinars and attract sign-ups. So for example, through having a great timely topic, using social media channels, using email, and then also making use of guest speakers and their networks as well. Then I covered having a smooth and professional presentation style. For example, firstly, through having practice calls, testing your tech and making sure that's all working, using a script for your introduction so you get all the information you need in there, mentioning your other webinars, and how to structure the webinar and your slideshow. And also, most importantly, not to panic if anything does go wrong, because it's all right. And then we looked at how to keep audiences engaged. So I covered using the chat, using polls, and using the Q&A functionality on webinar applications. And then finally, I had a quick look at what to include in follow-up materials when you're contacting the attendees and non-attendees for your webinar, such as a recorded version of the webinar, related guides from your own sources or external resources, and links to upcoming webinars as well. And finally, we're going to pop on to the Q&A now. So I'll just go on to the Q&A slide. I think Marie's coming back on.
Yes, that's right. Cool. So thanks for going through that, Camille. As I said, we've now going to just move on to the questions and answer section of the webinar. We've had a couple come through on the Q&A box. If you do have any questions or you can think of anything as we're talking, just do pop it in there and we will go through that now. So a couple of questions actually from Beth. First question, Camille, what do you think to Menti as a way to improve interaction in webinars?
This is an interesting one. I mean, this is why I should not be so confident in my position as a webinar guru, because I have not heard of Menti. I'm intrigued. I would like to hear more.
Perhaps we'll come back to that one. Beth, did you want to give some context around that? We can come back. We'll come back to that question.
That'd be fab. Thank you.
Natalie asks, how many event reminders do you think is a good number? I.e., you've sent your original first invite, you send another, but do you send a third? And I guess she's interested in both your thoughts as well as potentially other people.
Yeah, everyone do get involved in the chat with your experiences, because I mean, it can range from audience to audience as well, and depending on who you're advertising to. I think for us, a nice medium I found is sending the initial email to advertise the webinar, and then sending a bit of a backup message, say a week before, in terms of through email. I think that can be a good way to just send that one reminder without getting too spammy. It's about having that balance, really. And on social, I think, like I said, it's partly down to the type of platform. For example, Twitter. In the past, we've run it that, we've tweeted about it a couple of weeks in advance, week in advance, 2 days away, 1 day away, just kind of building up that momentum and that interest. And then say on Facebook and LinkedIn, we'll do a couple of posts, just because posts do last longer on those platforms. So you don't want things to get too spammy with the webinar reminders. And another really great thing is just to increase your reach across different platforms as well. So you're not just reliant on one or two platforms, like one social media profile. You're kind of capturing people at lots of different places. Can be a good scattergun approach to just make people more aware of your webinars, and if it's a series particularly.
Okay, cool, thank you. I'll just go back to the first question from Beth, because she's just clarified a little bit about what Menti is. So Menti is a little bit like using enhanced polls. It can put live stuff on the slideshow. It's pretty good, but you have to have the software, because she just didn't know that Zoom had polls. So I guess it's just like using enhanced.
Right, yeah, I think yeah, for example, you can use third-party software with Zoom as well, but we've not really had a need to go beyond using the Zoom polling features, but it depends on how in-depth you want to get with your polls. I think yeah, if it's kind of a touch point more than anything, where you just want to kind of get a general idea of where your audience is at, then I'd say that Zoom polls are pretty good. I've not really found them lacking, but yeah, I think it depends how far you want to go into the details of that. And then also there's also the consideration of having to kind of use different software and get that all together in the webinar itself. Might be a bit more stressful than having to just use sort of the one platform and the basic features. So it depends how much you want to go into it and whether that would be beneficial for you.
Okay, Natalie just put a comment in the chat, says that she said it sounds a little bit like I don't know how you pronounce that, Slido, SLI.do. Yeah, I guess perhaps there's probably lots and lots of these types of things, aren't there?
Yeah.
Okay, next question, Beth has asked a few more. I never normally address questions by name for the fear of confidentiality. Do you still recommend using first names? I kind of really have myself, haven't I? But yeah, I know you touched on it in your presentation.
Yes, I think we took a course on how to do webinars from the CIPD, and they recommended the use of first name. So that's the expertise we're basing it off. I think that as long as it's non-identifiable, it's fine. I think that because in these webinars, for example, the attendees can't see who else is attending. We can see full names of the audience and attendees, but the fellow attendees can't see that information. And I think it also depends on the sensitivity of the question as well, and whether someone prefers to be anonymous. You know, if it's quite a general comment or question, that's one thing, but particularly on HR topics and employment law topics, things can be quite sensitive information about the business. So you do need to be careful about just how much detail you go into there, and particularly if it is quite a sensitive question. Yeah, I think it's best not to use names, but that's kind of something that you can take on a topic by topic basis as well. And also, obviously, if anyone's using identifying information for other people in their questions as well, that's another thing you'd need to be really aware of as well. Yeah. So if, you know, if someone's saying like, oh, so-and-so from the accounts team did this or something, and you just want to make sure in that case that everything's very anonymous. So it can't really be put, but more general questions, for example, in a webinar about webinars, it's quite general stuff. So yeah, I think it's case by case.
Yeah, just on that, because I've been on some webinars where I've kind of facilitated, and they have been with employment lawyers, and obviously with everything that was happening around redundancies and furlough, and they had a lot of questions about very specific cases. And I remember also a couple of the guest speakers were saying that actually they're quite keen to keep it fairly general, and if people had specific, like, because I remember when we did do the furlough cases, it was like, oh, this person in my team has this, that, and the other, and we had a lot of them. And I think sometimes it's just also down to the person who's facilitating to try and bring it up a level a little bit, to either generalize it, or where it's quite sensitive, quite specific, some people prefer to have those answered offline, and that's like the request of the guest speakers. But that's just a couple of instances where I've come across that. Cool. Okay. Right, let me just go through all the questions. Next question is it best to use Q&A for questions in webinars rather than getting people to come on camera? She prefers the latter.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it's something that we're kind of keen on doing more in this webinar series, because basically in our topical webinar series, we started with quite large audiences. And I think that the chaos that may have ensued from us asking people to come on camera, it might have been quite intense. Hence we were using the Q&A just as a way to be able to get through more questions and just have more dependability in terms of being able to go through those. But I think for smaller webinars, and if you feel, especially if you know the people coming on the webinar quite well, particularly if they're sort of clients or staff, then it could be a better way in a smaller sort of webinar to be able to have people come on camera and sort of speak through that. That's definitely something we're considering doing for this series, actually. I'd be interested to hear your feedback on that if you prefer that. Yeah, I think that, again, it's funny because there's never really any sort of set rules to webinars, I think. I said rules earlier and said, oh, no, actually not rules, because it depends on your audience as well and sort of what you're aiming to achieve. So I think it's definitely another good option.
Cool. Just to chat. Next question from Charlotte is, do you have any tips on scripts and the format, as she finds them useful but sometimes a bit too wordy to remember, as it can be quite distracting when she's speaking?
Yes, yeah, it's a tricky one with scripts. I think they can be helpful until they hinder, basically. Like when I started writing up the script for this webinar, because I'm a blog writer as well and things, I tend to go very in depth into things when I write. And I think that I had to go through afterwards and go, okay, right, what's the most important pieces of information that I wrote there, and just really pare it down to the sort of overall points, just so that you can kind of read that and remind yourself and go, oh, yes, that's what I'm doing next. But you're not kind of, you know, reading the script or kind of getting too lost in it, basically. So that's the method I would recommend, that I tend to use, is even if you do want to start off quite big and expand out on what you want to say, and then maybe read through that a couple of times, then really pare it down to the bare bones of your presentation, so you're not sort of spending too much time on that template.
Cool. Next question from Louise is, what lead time do you work off? We like to work from around 6 weeks to get it full regular emails, but sometimes we do more topical ones at shorter notice.
Yes, this is another interesting one as well, especially around the timeliness element, because some things can just crop up and you go, oh yes, I really want to get on this right now. And you can shift around some webinars if you've got a schedule, but it really does depend. Like last year, we did quite a few webinars on furlough because that was a really, really big topic last year. And things would change last minute. For example, we actually had a webinar that was meant to come up on the job scheme instead, but we had to either reschedule it or change the topic. Yes, very last minute, because obviously the government did a little bit of a U-turn on that and extended furloughs. So you're like, what are we going to do now? So it can be quite last minute, and we did need to send updates to people just to say we have changed the topic of this. But I guess in other examples where something just crops up and you didn't already have something in place, you know, I would just go for it, definitely, because people are looking for topical things. You know, I think that webinars on how to do the redundancy process can be quite common, and people, you know, would probably look for that information elsewhere. Whereas if it's like, you know, something that's come up really quickly, like, wow, okay, the furlough scheme's been extended again. What does that mean? What are the new rules? What are we doing now? People have a lot of questions, a lot of doubts about that. So I think that's the kind of thing that works really well for a webinar. So even if it is a bit shorter notice, it's good to get on that. And then, I mean, you know, ideally, if you've got at least 3 or 4 weeks, I've found, you can attract a pretty good crowd. But then depending on the urgency of the topic, more people will be likely to click on and go, yes, I need to know about that. So it's certainly a balance.
Cool. Next question from Sarah is recommendations on good talks or webinars, specifically at becoming a more confident presenter. She's mentioned if you can't think of them now, you can email her separately. But whether you've got any at the top of your head.
Yeah, I'd not actually looked them up specifically. It's something I'd be interested to find out more about. I think, I mean, I guess most of my sort of learning around webinars has been very much on the job, watching other people present webinars and seeing what kind of works with them. I think that injecting a bit of your own personality into it as well really helps, because you're not kind of trying to be too different to what you are generally, and just kind of using a bit of humor, for example, I think can work quite well. And then also, yeah, just kind of practicing talking to a screen, because it is a very different experience to talking to people in real life or on a video call where you can at least see their faces. On a webinar, it can feel quite weird, because you're kind of, you know, you're talking to people but you can't see them. So I think building up your confidence in that is important as well. But yeah, unfortunately, I don't have any specific resources, but we can always have a chat about that afterwards.
Also has provided another topic of conversation that we can create a webinar on.
Definitely, yeah.
Cool, great, thank you for that. Last question from Carrie is, they've struggled to attract, even though that they use social media and email. Any further tips?
Yeah, it can be tricky when people aren't signing up and you're kind of wanting a bit more traction. Like, you know, we're running this new webinar series, people aren't as familiar with that, and we are sort of building up more of an audience there. I think that basically it's a question of testing the current methods, going, is it working? Is it not working? What else can we do? There's loads of things you can do on social media. I don't know if you've tried advertising webinars as well as your sort of organic posting on your channels. Like we're going to be doing a lot more of that, especially because we've got Hannah on as our social media exec now. We're going to be trying a lot of different methods on social. And then I think that, you know, there are sort of different ways you can get your name out there and get other people interested, perhaps guesting on other people's webinars, for example. That could be a really great way to kind of put across your own webinar series, because you're kind of already talking to people who are interested in webinars, preaching to the converted, and so on, because it's, yeah, just another way to kind of get engaged with that audience and get your name out there. So which is something that we do at Toolkit. We do kind of go on other people's webinars. We collaborate, and then also perhaps using other mediums such as blog posts and other content you're producing. And if it's related to a webinar, make sure to pop that in there, so when people from search engine traffic or wherever they're popping onto that blog post, they go, oh, there's a webinar as well, brilliant. And another thing we do is we have a page dedicated to webinars on our website for our topical webinars. We've got all our past recordings listed there, and then we have a little box for any upcoming webinars as well. We do get a few registrations through that because we do link people back to that quite often, so it kind of builds up that rapport of, that's where I can check out the myhrtoolkit webinars and just see which ones to sign up to. So it's just a few other things that we do that I can think of.
Great, thank you very much. That is all the questions. We've got quite a few through through that. Yeah,
thank you so much for your questions. They've been really good.
So we are actually, I forget, it's not an hour, is it? We've got this for 45 minutes, but hopefully that was really good and really helpful. Thank you, Camille, for sharing your tips and tricks of how to run some engaging webinars. Thank you also for all your questions. As we said, that we will do a follow-up, and there is a recording done of this webinar, so that we will send that out in case people kind of missed bits and pieces or had to drop off early. Just a bit of a reminder, if you found that useful, our next webinar is on webinar that looks at these type of topics is on the 4th of February. We'll be covering how social media can be beneficial for HR professionals, and I've set up a link into the chat box, but also we will do that on the follow-up email. We are running a number of other topical webinars on, what's our next topic? Is it flexible working, I think it was, or something like that? I can't remember now.
It's on engaging your remote employees. So
That's
ways
it.
to kind of engage with and motivate your remote employees.
Okay.
I can pop in a link to that as well, actually, if you want me to.
Yeah, we can add those in, because as I said, we've been doing quite a lot of different webinars, but you can find that information also on our website. So I think that's about it, but just obviously thank you very much for giving up your hour of your time this afternoon, and we will hope to see you on the next one.
Yeah, thank you very much, everyone. Bye.